What happens when the woman who built an empire from nothing, who danced her way out of the Bronx, conquered music, film, fashion, and fragrance, walks onto a daytime television set and discovers she wasn't invited for an interview at all, but for an execution? Jennifer Lopez has survived tabloid wars, public breakups broadcast in real time, Oscar snubs, tour cancellations, and an industry that has tried to define her shelf life since before she turned 40. She has endured every kind of criticism a woman in the spotlight can endure and kept moving. But she has never experienced anything quite like what happened the morning Joy Behar decided to stop pretending she was asking questions and started doing something far more personal. What began as a conversation about reinvention became a slow, deliberate dismantling until the target turned around and became the architect. By the time Jennifer Lopez stood up from that chair, every person in the studio understood they had witnessed something that could not be taken back. Subscribe and drop a comment below, because Joy Behar had absolutely no idea who she was provoking. Jennifer Lopez arrived 45 minutes early, which was unusual for a guest of her stature, but entirely consistent with who she was. She came with a small team, a publicist, a stylist, and her longtime assistant, and moved through the backstage corridors with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing this for 3 decades. The reason for the visit was her new documentary project, a deeply personal exploration of Latina identity in American entertainment that she had been developing for 2 years. It was the kind of work she rarely got credit for, substantive, rooted in community, driven by something other than commerce. Her publicist had specifically chosen The View because the show had a history of engaging with these topics, and Jennifer had expressed genuine enthusiasm about sitting with the panel and having a real conversation. When the cameras rolled and the familiar View theme music flooded the studio, the audience responded with the usual energy, applause, whistles, the controlled chaos of live daytime television. Whoopi Goldberg opened the show with a brief rundown of the day's topics, and the panel moved through their first segment on a recent political development with the usual mix of opinions and crosstalk. Then Whoopi turned to the camera with a warmer expression. Our next guest needs absolutely no introduction. She's a singer, an actress, a producer, a businesswoman, and now a filmmaker exploring Latina identity in America. Please welcome Jennifer Lopez. The applause was enormous. Jennifer walked onto the set with that signature stride, confident but not arrogant, acknowledging the audience with genuine warmth. She greeted each host individually, exchanged a hug with Whoopi, and settled into the guest chair with the practiced ease of someone who had done 10,000 interviews. "Thank you so much for having me," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the distinctive blend of warmth and precision that had defined her public persona for decades. "I've been looking forward to this." Sarah Haynes opened with a question about the documentary, what inspired it, why now, what she hoped audiences would take away. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her eyes lighting up as she described the project with the kind of passion that was impossible to fake. "I grew up watching my mother work double shifts and still finding time to teach us about where we came from," Jennifer said. "And I realize that so many Latina women in this industry have had to choose between being authentic and being successful. This project is about the women who refused to choose, the ones who brought their whole selves to the table and changed the game because of it, not in spite of it." The audience was engaged. The other hosts were nodding. Even the camera operators seemed drawn in by the sincerity of what she was sharing. It was exactly the kind of segment the producers had hoped for: substantive, emotional, beautifully articulated. That was when Joy Behar shifted in her chair. She had been quiet for the first 4 minutes of the interview, which was unusual. Regular viewers knew that Joy's silence was never passive. It was tactical. She sat with her arms crossed loosely, a half-smile playing on her lips, her eyes fixed on Jennifer with an expression that the other hosts would later describe as loaded. "Well, that all sounds very meaningful," Joy said, and the slight emphasis she placed on the word "sounds" changed the temperature in the room by several degrees. "But I have to wonder, and I say this with genuine curiosity, Isn't this just another chapter in the Jennifer Lopez reinvention playbook? Jennifer's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The warmth didn't leave her face, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "I'm sorry, what do you mean by that?" Joy uncrossed her arms and leaned forward, that familiar posture that signaled she was settling in for something. "I mean, you've reinvented yourself more times than Madonna. Singer, actress, perfume mogul, fashion designer, now documentary filmmaker and cultural ambassador. At what point do people start wondering which Jennifer Lopez is the real one?" The studio went noticeably quieter. Whoopi's hand moved toward the table as if she were about to intervene, then pulled back. The producers behind the cameras exchanged a look that anyone who worked in live television would recognize, the look that said, "This wasn't in the briefing." Jennifer took a measured breath. "I think all of those things are the real me, Joy. People evolve, they grow, they explore different parts of themselves. That's not reinvention, that's living." "Sure," Joy said, drawing the word out with a tone that turned agreement into something closer to dismissal. "But there's living, and then there's branding, and you, Jennifer, are perhaps the most brilliantly branded human being in entertainment. Every relationship, every career move, every public appearance, it all feels very curated." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Jennifer's jaw tightened, but she held her composure with the discipline of someone who had spent decades being scrutinized by people far more hostile than a morning show host. "I think that's an unfair characterization," Jennifer replied, her voice still controlled but with a new edge. "I've been one of the most transparent public figures in this industry. I've let cameras into my life. I've talked openly about my struggles, my failures, my insecurities. If that looks curated to you, maybe that says more about how you view the world than how I live mine." Joy's eyes narrowed slightly, and the corner of her mouth twitched in what might have been surprise or satisfaction. It was difficult to tell which. Transparent. That's an interesting word choice, because I was just looking at some of your recent press, and it seems like the transparency only extends to whatever's convenient at the moment. "What exactly are you referring to?" Jennifer asked, and now there was no disguising the sharpness in her voice. "Well, for example," Joy said, flipping through her notes with exaggerated casualness, "you talk about Latina empowerment and cultural identity, but you spent the better part of the last 2 years in the tabloids for your personal life. The wedding, the house, the separation rumors. At some point, doesn't the personal drama undermine the message? Doesn't it become hard for people to take the cultural ambassador seriously when the ambassador is living what looks like a telenovela?" The audience inhaled collectively. Sarah Haynes looked down at the table. Alyssa Farah Griffin's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Whoopi's expression had gone very still, the kind of stillness that preceded a storm. Jennifer sat perfectly motionless for a 3 count that felt like 30 seconds. When she spoke, her voice had dropped to a register that anyone from the Bronx would recognize as the last stop before the gloves came off entirely. "Joy," she said, "did you just reduce my life to a telenovela?" "I'm just pointing out what the public sees," Joy replied, but there was a flicker of something in her expression now, the first hint that she might have misjudged the trajectory of this conversation. "What the public sees," Jennifer repeated slowly. "What the public sees is what people like you decide to show them. You had a chance to ask me about a documentary that took 2 years of my life, about Latina women who changed this industry, about the systemic barriers that women of color face in entertainment. Instead, you're asking me about my marriages. I think your marriages are relevant to..." "Relevant to what?" Jennifer cut in, and for the first time, her voice carried real heat. "Relevant to your ratings? Relevant to whatever narrative makes for the most entertaining television? Because they're certainly not relevant to the work I came here to discuss." The studio audience was absolutely silent. The kind of silence that only happens when a room full of people collectively realizes they are witnessing something that cannot script it. Behind the cameras, a producer was speaking urgently into a headset, but nobody was cutting to commercial. Joy straightened in her chair, her chin lifting in the way it always did when she felt challenged. "I think you're being defensive, Jennifer. I'm asking questions that any journalist—" "You're not a journalist," Jennifer said. The three words landed like three separate detonations. Joy's mouth stayed open, but nothing came out. The other hosts froze. Even the studio lights seemed to dim for a moment, as if the room itself was bracing for what came next. "You're not a journalist," Jennifer repeated, her voice now carrying the full weight of 30 years of dealing with exactly this kind of treatment. "Journalists ask questions to understand. You ask questions to provoke. There's a difference, and the fact that you don't know the difference is exactly why we're having this conversation instead of the one your producers planned." Joy recovered quickly. She always did, but her voice was higher now, thinner. "I have every right to ask challenging questions. That's what the show is about." "Challenging questions," Jennifer said, and something shifted in her posture. She leaned back slightly, crossed one leg over the other, and regarded Joy with an expression that was somehow both compassionate and devastating. "Let me ask you a challenging question, Joy. When was the last time you built something?" The question hung in the air like a blade. "Excuse me?" Joy said. "When was the last time you created something from nothing?" Jennifer continued, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "I'm not being rhetorical. I genuinely want to know. Because I've spent my entire career building a music career when they said I couldn't sing well enough, building an acting career when they said I was just a dancer, building a business empire when they said I was just a pretty face. And every single time I built something, someone who had never built anything sat behind a desk or a microphone and told me it wasn't real." Joy's face was coloring now, a deep flush spreading from her neck upward. "I've been in broadcasting for over 40 years. And in those 40 years, Jennifer said, leaning forward now with an intensity that made Joy visibly lean back, how many times have you sat across from a woman who clawed her way out of poverty, who outworked everyone in every room she ever entered, who built a career that spans 3 decades and multiple industries, and your first instinct was to ask her about her marriages?" The question was surgical. Joy's mouth worked, but no sound came out. The audience seemed to stop grieving entirely. "I grew up in Castle Hill in the Bronx," Jennifer continued, and now her voice carried something raw and unpolished, the accent she usually smoothed for television bleeding back in. "My parents were Puerto Rican immigrants who worked themselves to the bone so their daughters could have a shot at something better. And I took that shot. I took every shot. I auditioned for everything. I danced until my feet bled. I sang in studios where the engineers laughed behind my back. And I built something that nobody can take away from me." She pointed directly at Joy, and the gesture carried the force of everything she'd been holding back. "Not you, not the tabloids, not the critics who've been writing my obituary since I turned 40, not anyone. So when you sit there with your notes and your smirk and your so-called tough questions, understand something. You're not challenging me. You're not exposing me. You're showing everyone in this room and everyone watching at home exactly what happens when a woman succeeds beyond what other people are comfortable with." Joy's hands were shaking slightly on the desk. She made one more attempt to regain control. "I think you're reading too much into my questions, Jennifer. I was simply—" "Simply what?" Jennifer's voice snapped like a whip. "Simply reducing a 3-decade career to a series of relationships? Simply implying that a woman who has sold 80 million records, produced award-winning films, and built a billion-dollar brand is somehow not authentic because she also happened to fall in love publicly? Is that what you were simply doing?" Whoopi finally spoke, her voice carrying the low authority that only she could command. "I think we need to take a breath here. "No, Whoopi," Jennifer said, and the fact that she said it gently, with genuine respect, somehow made it more powerful than if she had shouted. "I need to finish this." Because what Joy is doing right now isn't new. It's the oldest trick in the book. When you can't diminish a woman's talent, you attack her personal life. When you can't question her work ethic, you question her authenticity. When you can't find a real flaw, you invent one and call it journalism. She turned back to Joy, who was now sitting very still in her chair, her earlier confidence stripped away like paint under a heat gun. "You called my life a telenovela. You know what a telenovela actually is, Joy? It's a story about a woman who faces impossible odds and keeps fighting. A woman who gets knocked down by people who think they're better than her and gets back up every single time. A woman who refuses to disappear just because it would be more convenient for everyone else. So yeah, maybe my life is a telenovela. And in that telenovela, you're the character who sits on the sidelines making cruel comments while the protagonist keeps winning." The silence that followed was so complete that the ambient hum of the studio equipment was audible. Sarah Haynes had tears in her eyes. Alyssa was staring at Jennifer with an expression that hovered between awe and disbelief. Even the camera operators had gone still, as if moving might break whatever spell had settled over the room. Joy finally found her voice, but it was a diminished version of the weapon she usually wielded. "I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," Jennifer said quietly, and the quietness was worse than the fire that had preceded it. "You meant every word. You meant the reinvention comment. You meant the branding comment. You meant the telenovela comment. You came into this interview with a thesis that Jennifer Lopez is a manufactured product, not a real person, and you were going to prove that thesis regardless of what I said or how I said it." She stood up from her chair, and the movement carried a finality that everyone in the studio could feel in their bones. "But here's what you didn't account for, Joy. I've been fighting people like you my entire life. People who decided what I was before I ever opened my mouth. People who thought they could define me because it made them feel powerful. People who confused their own limitations for my ceiling." She straightened her jacket with the precision of someone who had been doing this in front of cameras since she was 23 years old. "I came here to talk about Latina women who changed the world. Women who were told they were too loud, too ambitious, too much, and who proved that too much was exactly the right amount. Instead, I got a masterclass in exactly why that documentary needs to exist." Jennifer looked directly into the camera, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who has already won and knows it. "To every girl watching this who's ever been told she's too much, too ambitious, too emotional, too driven, too loud, let me tell you something from someone who's heard it all. They don't say those things because you're too much. They say them because they're not enough." She turned back to Joy one final time, and her expression held something that was harder to absorb than anger. It was pity. "You had a platform today, Joy. You could have used it to lift someone up. You could have used it to have a real conversation about identity and culture and what it means to build something lasting. Instead, you used it to do what you always do, tear someone down and call it insight. I hope one day you understand the difference between being sharp and being cruel, because right now, you don't." Jennifer Lopez walked off the stage of The View with her shoulders back and her head held high. Her heels clicked against the studio floor in a rhythm that sounded like punctuation, final, precise, unapologetic. The cameras followed her until she disappeared behind the stage door, and then they swung back to the panel, where 4 women sat in varying states of shock. Joy Behar was motionless in her chair, staring at the empty guest seat with an expression that would be dissected in screenshots for weeks. It wasn't anger, it wasn't defiance, it was the look of someone who had reached for a weapon and discovered it was made of glass. The studio was so quiet that when Whoopi finally said, "We'll be right back," her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. They cut to commercial, but nobody moved. Behind the scenes, producers were already fielding calls. Social media was already igniting. and Joy Behar sat at the table where she had spent decades sharpening her tongue, realizing for the first time that some people were forged from something her words could not cut. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Joy Behar out of line, or was she just doing her job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.